Welcome to La Plaza de Cultura y Artes. My name is Mesli from Visitor Services. Tonight we'll go ahead and be having an engaging evening, a conversation between Reyna Grande and Julissa Arce, moderated by Yarel Ramos from Univisión. Reyna is an award-winning author, motivational speaker, and a writing instructor. She'll also be discussing her novel, A Ballad of Love and Glory. Julissa, who left behind a Wall Street career, is an outspoken advocate for immigrants who will present her latest work, You Sound Like a White Girl, the cast of Rejecting Assimilation. Thank you for joining us tonight. I will go ahead and pass down the mic to Yarel whenever you're ready. I'll start.
Hi, hello. Hi everyone, hello, buenas noches, good evening. Let's get comfortable here.
Yeah, these chairs are hard to navigate.
Once again, buenas tardes, buenas noches. I don't even know what time, 7? Yeah, noches. Good evening everyone, my name is Yarel Ramos. I am super excited to be here today. It's so nice to kind of be back, right? To like seeing people and sharing space with other like-minded individuals and hear from like amazing women. So it's just a pleasure to be here. Thank you to La Plaza for inviting me, and thank you to these wonderful ladies who have done amazing work. We're going to be doing a Q&A for the first 40 minutes of some questions that we've prepped, and the last 20 minutes we'll open it up for all of you if you have any questions or comments or anything that you'd like to also share with us today. English is good, right? English we're good? Yes? Okay. Well, thank you also, Julissa, Reyna, gracias for being here. Thank you for your wonderful work. First of all, let's start off with that. Tell us a little bit about your new baby, your new project, and what's been, what's the community sharing with you about it and your experience writing it. Reyna, I'll start with you.
Hola. Muchas gracias por estar aquí. I see a lot of familiar faces and also some new faces, so new friends that have come out. So thank you so much for supporting our event. And yeah, so A Ballad of Love and Glory is my newest book that came out about a little bit over a month ago. And if you're familiar with my other work, I think it's gonna surprise you because it is completely different from anything that I've ever done before. And I wanted to challenge myself as a writer. I feel that with each project, I want to grow as a writer. I'm not gonna grow in height, so I might as well grow in my skills as a writer. And so this book, it really kicked my butt, but it forced me to leave my comfort zone, which was autobiographical fiction or memoir, and going to a different genre, which is historical fiction, which is a total beast. I read over 100 books just so that you only read one. And I was fascinated by this time in history, the Mexican-American War, or the U.S. invasion of Mexico, as it should be called. I didn't know anything about it. I didn't grow up learning about it. If you went through U.S. schools, you probably also didn't learn about it because we skip over it. And it's as if it never happened, and that's basically what this country wants us to believe. And I wanted to teach myself about this time period, so I decided I'm going to write about it. And I did. I taught myself a lot, but I also empowered myself because in learning this history, I felt that I was reclaiming our history, and it gave me a different perspective of myself as a Mexican, as an immigrant, as a Spanish speaker. And by the time I finished writing the book, I was a different person. I was a more empowered person. And all this time I had allowed mainstream society to make me feel like an outsider for being Mexican, for speaking Spanish. And when I learned this history, it forced me to reframe that and to see myself as someone who actually does belong here. And I said, I'm not the outsider that I was told I was. Yeah.
So if you know me, you know that I am a big Reyna Grande fan. I love all of Reyna's books, and she has been not only an incredible friend, but an incredible mentor. And so when we started chatting about our new books, we realized that like our books are very different, right? Her book is a historical fiction novel, and my book is nonfiction. It's about ideas and things. But we did realize that while our books are so different, they both taught us similar things, right? When you were talking about reclaiming, like so much of my book is about reclaiming the history that I didn't learn, that was not taught to me in school, and you know, I think a lot of the process of writing this new book really does transform you. I feel like every book that you write, every book that you put your heart into, makes you a little bit of a different person because you learn things about yourself in that writing process that you didn't know before. Whether it's, I'm actually capable of writing this book, which by the way, the first 4,000 words of this book were the most painful things to write. And then once, I don't know, 4,000 is like a magic number for me. Once I hit 4,000 words, I was like, I can do this, even though I had to write 50,000 words after that. But the first 4,000 were just the most difficult. And the book is divided into two parts. The first part of the book is about the lies of assimilation, the lies that we're outsiders, that we don't belong here, the lie that if we speak English, that will help us to belong, the lie that if we succeed in this country, we make money, we have this prestigious job, that's what will make us succeed. The lie that as we get closer to whiteness, the safer we are, or the more opportunities we will have. And I think that's a big mistake that our community has made in the past, is to seek whiteness as a form of protection, as a form of advancement. And then the second part of the book is about reclaiming. It's about reclaiming all of the things that we lose when we take on that process of assimilation. Reclaiming our history, reclaiming our culture, our heritage, and hopefully when we're done sort of with that reclaiming, we can make statements like the ones Reyna just made. Like, we're not the outsiders. And to really know that deeply, right? To know the ways in which our history has been appropriated. I mean, today is Cinco de Mayo, right? And I can't tell you how many emails I received with little sombreros on them to sell me groceries, right? And to tell me to put on a fiesta. And none of these people who are sending these emails know the significance of today. Today is celebrated because Mexico fought off imperialism. And the history of Mexico is so deeply connected to the history of the United States. The Battle of Puebla today, that was won by an outnumbered Mexican army, it meant not just a lot to Mexico, but it also was seen as a win against slavery. Because Napoleon at that time was supposedly, supporting the Confederacy, or wanted to support the Confederacy. And so by defeating him, Mexico's history is deeply connected to what happened in the U.S. And Reyna will tell you more about the Mexican-American War because she studied that so much more. And
we lost, by the way. That's why we celebrate Cinco de Mayo. It's one of the times we actually won.
But that victory meant a lot, So, anyways, some of those things you'll find them in the book. That's what the book is about. The new book, and it's funny when you were asking about what has the community told you about the book. Y'all love it, thank you. But also I keep hearing things about the title, and like some people really love the title, You Sound Like a White Girl, because they're like, I've heard that all my life. And then some people just look at the title and they're like, I don't agree with her. And I'm like, I agree that You Sound Like a White Girl is not what we should be telling people, and that's why you should read the book.
I love that. I think, Reyna, you touched on this a little bit, but for you, this is your first historical fiction novel. And for you, Julissa, your previous two books were memoirs. What was it about switching up the genre? Like, why did you decide to do something different? Was it the landscape of books, of literature, of publishing, or was it something much more personal?
Yeah, I think it was me wanting to challenge myself because usually when I think of a story to write, I always turn inward to find a story. And I use a lot of my own experiences to write it, whether I'm writing fiction or my memoirs. I mean, my memoirs are about me. So with this book, I thought I was finally taking a break from writing about myself, and I wanted to write about through different eyes, to see the world differently, and to go back to the 1840s, which was a very defining moment in the history of both of these countries, Mexico and the US. And I wanted to learn more about the creation of the southern border as we know it today. And it's a history that is very violent. The southern border was drawn with blood and gunpowder. And so this was a journey that I undertook. It took me almost 7 years to write the book. And I wanted to teach myself about it. But my entry point into the novel, I never thought I was gonna write a novel about war. But when I was promoting The Distance Between Us back in 2013, somebody at an event came up to me and asked me if I had ever heard of the St. Patrick's Battalion. So I think some of you have heard of the St. Patrick's Battalion, others of you haven't. Los San Patricios, el Batallón de San Patricio. And I had never heard of them. And this person said, well, the St. Patrick's Battalion was a unit in the Mexican army composed of deserters from the US Army. And most of them were Irish, as was its leader, John Riley, who was an Irishman from County Galway. And these men decided to desert the US Army. And it was at a high risk because desertion was punishable by death. And yet they made this decision to leave the US Army and switch sides and help Mexico defend itself against the invaders. And I went home and I researched the St. Patrick's Battalion. I became fascinated by them, by John Riley. And then I realized that I didn't really know enough about this history, but I started to ask questions like, why did they do it? What led to them switching sides? And why did they want to help Mexico defend itself? So I started to research the St. Patrick's Battalion, and then I learned, and at first I was hesitant because, these are Irishmen, and we've had discussions about who gets to tell whose story, right? And I was hesitating about, is this a story for me to tell, or is this someone else's story? But then I decided, well, in Mexico, the St. Patrick's Battalion are seen as heroes. Son los héroes, the Irish heroes of Mexico, and every year there's a parade in their honor. If you go to San Angel, to Plaza San Jacinto, there's a bust of John Riley in the plaza. There's a plaque on the wall listing all the names of the San Patricios that were hanged by the US Army for helping Mexico. And so they're celebrated, to this day. So then I thought, well, why can't I write about them? I think I can. And I started to write about John Riley. And I also discovered how much we have in common with the Irish. That even though today we see the Irish and Irish Americans as part of the mainstream, as benefiting from white privilege, but in the 19th century, the Irish were the least wanted immigrant group in the country. They were demonized, they were reviled, their white skin didn't protect them from nativism. And they experienced a lot of ethnic discrimination, but also religious discrimination because they were Catholic. So to me, I ended up, finding all these connections, especially as a Mexican immigrant. So I mined my own experiences and my own immigrant trauma, and that's how I managed to capture the experiences of these Irish immigrants in the 19th century. So that's kind of how I made my way into the book. And then as I was researching, I came across a poem written by John Greenleaf Whittier, which I was living in Whittier when I found the poem. That's why it jumped out at me, because I wasn't familiar with his poetry. So I find this poem called The Angels of Buena Vista. And I was surprised because it was written in 1847, right in the midst of the war or the invasion. And it surprised me because almost all of the writing that was coming out during this period was very anti-Mexican. Since the US was at war with Mexico, almost everything was anti-Mexican. But here comes John Greenleaf Whittier writing this poem about the Mexican soldaderas who were out in the battlefield. And his poem recognizes their courage and their bravery and their sacrifice that they did during the war. And the main protagonist of his poem is Jimena. And when I found that poem, I thought, I found my female protagonist. Here she is. And also during my research, I learned that the real John Riley, there was a rumor that he had fallen in love with the Mexican widow. So then I grabbed Jimena and I said, here's my widow who steals John Riley's heart. And that was when the novel really came into, took its shape for me at that point, because I knew it was going to be not just a war story, but a love story between John Riley and Jimena. And I wanted to explore how these two people came together in a very, very uncertain times, and how they helped each other survive this moment.
If you have not read the novel, and you have to start reading it tonight, it's so good. What was the question?
The question was about genre, changing your genre.
Oh yeah. So my first two books are memoirs, and I think, in some ways, it's easy to write about yourself because you know what happened. And in some ways, writing about yourself is the most difficult thing to do, because you have to be really honest with yourself in a way that maybe you're not ready to be. You have to put on the page things that you've never even said out loud to yourself or to your closest friends. And so it's really hard to write about yourself. This book, you sound like a white girl. I started writing it, my book proposal was a series of personal essays of how I assimilated and how now I am decolonizing and reclaiming. And then I started writing these essays, and I sort of just kept asking these questions to myself, when I was talking about not knowing my history, I remember asking my dad one time when I was in 7th or 8th grade, where were we? Where were we when these things were happening in US history? I'm learning about this US history, and there's no talk about Mexicans. Where were we? And that question stayed with me. And so when I was writing these personal essays, this question kept coming up for me. Where were we? When I was writing about Andres Guardado, the 18-year-old Salvadorian kid who was shot in the back by police, I wanted to know more about Andres, but also more about other Latinos who have been killed by police. Because there's not a lot of data about the Latinos who were killed by police. I wanted to know how deep this really went, how structural it was. And I came across two stories. One of them was 100 years old, Porvenir, Texas, where the Texas Rangers ransacked this town, Porvenir, and they killed 18 Mexican boys and men at close range. And then I started learning about the really horrible history of the Texas Rangers and how they really rained terror on Mexicans and on Native people as the U.S. made its way westward. Then I learned about the story of Joe Campos in Texas, who was a Vietnam veteran who had come back from the war, was drinking at a bar, and eventually Houston police beat him to death and threw him over the Buffalo Bayou, while one of them said, let's throw him in the river to see if a wetback could swim. And I grew up in Texas, and I had never heard about him or his story. So every time I learned something, I wanted to know more. Right? I wanted to know, okay, I need to know how many. I need to know when, I need to know their names. And I started just learning more and more of these stories. And so then it became clear to me that this book couldn't just be about me and my experiences. It had to be wider than that and deeper than that, because these things that I was experiencing today, that we collectively as a community are experiencing today, are structural, and they have really deep roots, and there's a really big history. And that history is not in the past. That history is so alive in our everyday lives in ways that we don't even realize it. Just today, Greg Abbott was talking about taking away the right of undocumented students to attend public schools in Texas. Texas has already tried to do that in 1982. And that case in Tyler, Texas, went all the way up to the Supreme Court, Doe versus Preidler, I think it's called. And the Supreme Court ruled that, yes, undocumented people should have access to higher education. Not to higher education, to public schools, right? And now here we are, all these years later, litigating those same things again. As we know,
California tried to do that too, eh?
Yes, they did. Yes, they did.
Let's remember that. No
Yes.
nada más en Texas.
Yes, y'all did. So my point is, though, that this history keeps coming back. And so we don't know that this happened, then we might think that these issues are new or that we're just starting to deal with them, when in reality, like, we have been dealing with this. And not only have these terrible things happen to us, but I was having dinner with a friend the other day who told me that how come we never had our own newspapers or our own clinics? I'm like, yes, we did have our own newspapers, and yes, we did have our own clinics, but we've never learned about those things. And so not only have these horrible things happen to us, but we have taken leadership and have taken a role in creating these spaces for ourselves. And because we don't learn about them, we sort of forget that there are people who have already fought on our behalf, and that we should continue to build on the things that they have done for our community, also learn from the mistakes, learn from the ways in which they were super machismos in the Chicano movement and anti-Black in some ways. So we learn from those things and we do better. But if we don't even know that those things happen, then how can we move forward, right? And so that's why I decided that this couldn't just be personal essays, though they are interesting stories. I thought that there was a more impactful way to talk about these issues by weaving in some of my personal stories with this really deep history that I started learning.
So there, obviously with history comes a lot of research, right? Reyna, you mentioned that it took you 400 books, did you say?
Oh,
No, ¿cuánto? 40?
100.
100. I was like, damn, I heard 400. I was like, that's a lot.
Well, that's not counting all the articles, the blogs.
Yeah. Everything else.
maybe
Around 400, yeah.
You have to say 400.
Right. So, how did you approach the research? What challenges do you find when you're doing research and it's something like you both mentioned that we don't really learn about it in school, that it's not around us as it should be. What challenges did you face? How did you approach it? And what is your suggestion for anybody also wanting to learn about our history, the way that you also learned it through writing these books?
Yeah, so I didn't have training doing this level of history. When I wrote, one of my favorite books that I had writing-wise was Dancing with Butterflies, which is about folklorico dancers. And the research I did for that book was to go to a lot of folklorico shows, talk to folklorico dancers and dance directors, and read books on folklorico and other forms of dance. And that was fun. So then with this book, I thought it was going to be fun. It was painful. I'll rather get another root canal. It was brutal, having to do this research, very tedious. But I did learn a lot. And I kind of figured it out eventually how to do it. Like I started by researching the St. Patrick's Battalion. There are 3 books that I really love if you want to read them. The Rogue's March, Shamrock and Sword, and The Irish Soldiers of Mexico. So those were 3 books specifically about the San Patricios. And then I opened it up by reading everything I could about the Mexican-American War. So I read a bunch of books on that. And then I read about each battle. You know, the Battle of Palo Alto, the Battle of Resaca de la Palma, of Monterrey, and Cerro Gordo, and Churubusco, Chapultepec. So every battle, just to have a really clear visual of how they each kind of went down. And then I read books on a bunch of biographies on Santa Anna, because he's one of my main protagonists. So biographies of Santa Anna and also his memoirs. And then I have some secondary characters that are historical figures, like Juan Seguin, Juan Cortina. So I had to read about them too. General Taylor, Braxton Bragg, Winfield Scott, you know, so all these historical figures, I had to read about them. And Santa Anna was addicted to cockfighting, so then I had to read everything about cockfighting. And Jimena is a curandera, so I had to read everything about curanderismo. And then I had to research the flora and fauna of where she lives, you know, along the region of along the Rio Grande, because as a curandera, she's very familiar with the medicinal plants, but I had to make sure that they were from that area. And so it took me like half an hour, you know, an hour sometimes, just to make sure that I got my plants right, and that the huizaches were blooming when I said they were blooming, and that, you know, the mezquitas were blooming when I said they were blooming, and all of that was very, very time consuming. But I wanted to be accurate. I wanted to build trust with my reader, because I didn't want you to question what you were reading. I didn't want you to think that I had taken liberties with the history or with the details, that I had manipulated them or distorted them just to fit my story. So I tried to remain very faithful to the way the events unfolded, to the places where everything happened and how it happened, and the way that I portray, you know, different characters, and how I write about the Rangers, for example, you know, their brutality, the violence that they wreaked on Mexicans. All of it is accurate. So that was important to me, and that's why I double-checked and triple-checked, and even though it was a novel, I still wanted it to be as accurate as it could possibly be.
Me está doliendo aquí, así después me curas. You're saying you learned everything about curanderismo.
Te voy a poner un nopal. Oh, te voy a poner un nopal en tu quemadura.
I know. I burned myself curling my hair the other day. Yeah, so you know the thing about writing about history, and history that hasn't really been widely told. The challenge is, there's 2 challenges. One is a lot of the history that we have is told from one very specific point of view, right? It's probably a John Smith that wrote the book. And it's from his perspective. So a lot of the history that we learn is told from the perspective of a white man. And so part of my challenge was I didn't want to read more history books that white men had written, to be honest. You know, I was like, I really need to find some of the revisionist history. And there's a huge movement about revisionist history. Revisionist history does not mean that they're rewriting history, that they're rewriting facts. They're presenting that history from a different perspective. And they are also sharing things that haven't been shared before. Right? And, thank God for historians, thank God for people who get PhDs in history, because they're the ones that really have the tough job of going through archives, newspaper clippings, things that only exist in like outdated paper files, to then write these like amazing books that we can read and that are very accessible to read. So that was one of the challenges. The other one was I kept trying to research books that talked about race in America. Because I wanted to know, I wanted just to read all these books about race in America. And, I found a lot of books that talked about race in America in a very binary way. Right? It was a very black and white binary in the way that they talked about identity in America. So, and then sometimes, so for example, books like Working Towards Whiteness, or How the Irish Became White, those books were really, I'm really glad that I read them. But very often, books like that only had like one paragraph about Mexicans during all of these really big times when we clearly were here and were influencing in one way or another the way that race relationships unfolded in the United States. So, but luckily in that paragraph there would usually be a little note, like a little number. So I would go to the back to the notes and I would find where they got that note from. And sometimes that note would lead me to a book that was written by a Latino or Latina that actually did talk more extensively about Mexicans in the United States, about Latinos in the United States, that talked more about the history that I really wanted to learn about. So I had to become a little detective to try to find where is that source. Sometimes it would be one little note that would take me to an article, and then that article would have another note that then would finally take me to the source. So that was really time consuming to try to find all of this history. And then, after I read all of these very academic books, then that academic voice was stuck in my head. So then when I was writing, it was like Professor Julissa writing this book, and it was very academic, and then, Reyna was like, this sucks, you need to rewrite this.
Okay, I didn't say it like that.
How did you say it, Reyna? How did you say it? You were nicer? Yeah.
That's what I read.
That's what you heard in your head.
And I was like, well, yes, she's right. Because when I was reading, it just sounded, my whole point of wanting to write this book was so that it could be accessible to all of us, because one of my beefs with this history is that it's really only accessible to people with college degrees and PhD students. Mm-hmm. And part of what I wanted to do was to take all of this history, all of this amazing body of work of Latino academics, and sort of synthesize it in a way that anybody could read this book and anybody can understand its history. So I had to do a lot of editing in order for that to happen.
Both books deal with loss, right? Which is, I think, a topic and a theme that is very relatable across all genres. Reyna, your book, Loss of Love in a Time of War, and Julissa, your book, Loss of Culture in a way. How did you guys set yourself in that mindset to write about something like that? Did you connect also your personal experiences? And what's the most difficult part about writing about loss?
Well, I wasn't just writing about the loss of love, but also the loss of the land. I mean, this was the biggest land grab, aside from the Native Americans who lost their land. And this territory was twice robbed, right? I mean, the Spaniards robbed it from the Native Americans, and then the U.S. robbed it from Mexico. So there's that loss of the land. And yeah, I mean, there's a loss of love, and my characters experience a lot of that. Especially Jimena, she loses her loved ones. She loses her father earlier on, and her husband, she loses her husband when he joins the guerrilla to try to get the invaders off their land, and he felt that it was his sacred duty to protect the frontier, and he ended up losing his life to the Texas Rangers. And then, of course, she experiences the loss of her grandmother later on. So she is dealing with a lot of loss, and not just that, but then seeing her countrymen dying, you know. And in the book, I do have to warn you, you know, if you read the book, is that not if you read the book, when you read the book, I have to warn you that I didn't shy away from immersing you in the battles. I know that my cover has a beautiful sunset on it. This is a case where you should not judge the book by its cover. Because, and I wanted a battlefield. I got a sunset. But I wanted a battlefield because I didn't want my reader to go into it thinking that this is a, you know, feel-good beach story. It's really not. It will really impact you emotionally. But I was writing about an invasion, and my characters are on the front lines, and so I couldn't not write about it, you know. And we ourselves right now have been witnessing an invasion happening before our eyes. I mean, we've been seeing it on our TV screens, on our phone screens. We've been following what's going on in Ukraine, and you have seen the devastation. You know, you have seen the brutality, and we have seen what imperialism looks like. And so in the novel, that is what you get. You know, you do get those moments where you see all the gory, the gore and the blood and the death of the battles. So I did want you to know that going into the book, you know, because I know that some people are gonna struggle a little bit with it, but I think it's important for us to not turn away from it. You know, we have turned away from it for so long, and when I wrote this book, I felt that this war has been ignored and forgotten for so long. If I'm gonna write a book about it, I'm gonna write about it. It's not just gonna be a mere backdrop to my love story. So the war is front and center, and I try to do it justice by always having it as almost like a main character, along with John and Jimena. The war itself is also a main character.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the book, a lot of You Sound Like a White Girl deals with loss, whether it's the loss of our language, the loss of our identity, the loss of our land. And those things are difficult to write about, but it's also, it's sort of like fascinating when you're writing or you're reading something and just like a little light bulb goes off in your head, right? Like when I was learning about how after the Mexican-American War, Mexicans who were living in the land, and by the way, the border was drawn so that the United States could keep the most amount of land with the least amount of Mexicans. Because the US never wanted to acquire Mexicans, they just wanted the land. We just happened to be an unwanted bounty of that war. But a light bulb went off in my head when I realized that Mexicans supposedly got citizenship, right? And I say supposedly because many historians sort of argue that perhaps as Mexicans were told they could get citizenship, but they were never actually able to claim it. But on paper, these Mexicans got citizenship at a time when only white people could become citizens. And so instead of there being a change in the Constitution or a change in Congress through a law that said you Mexicans can be citizens and you Mexicans have these equal rights, we sort of were just swept under the rug of whiteness. And I think that was like the worst thing that could have happened to us. Because we were never, from the beginning, we were not able to sort of form our own identity. That I think was the beginning of us seeking whiteness as a way of approval and as a way of seeking rights. So so that was sort of like a difficult thing to like learn about. But I would say the hardest part of the book for me to write, I would say two things. One, writing about that was really, really hard. It took me, I had to put the pen down several times to be able to finish. And if you've heard the audiobook, I really couldn't get through it without like my voice cracking and having to take time to cry, because it was just so difficult to write about it. And that's why I also think that the second part of the book for me was so important, because the first part of the book is heavy, and I didn't want to stay in that heaviness. And then somebody asked me, well, how did you get like over being angry? And I was like, well, I am angry in some parts of the book. You know, there's some, and especially if you've heard the audiobook, like I hope that you can hear my anger, and I hope more of us get angry, because some of these things should make us angry. But I also didn't want to stay in that anger, because after all this shit, I don't also then want to give up my joy. Like, I want to reclaim that joy. I want to have fun, and I want to be happy, and I want to celebrate us, and I want to celebrate our culture and our language and our food and our heritage. And so the second part of the book was so important for me to have that change in tone from these really heavy things to a more celebratory, to more of a celebratory tone.
What was it like working on the books during the pandemic, during like so much uncertainty, also the publishing space being much more difficult for women of color, for stories like these? How was it like for you working through these times?
Yeah, actually, this book helped me through the pandemic, because I was feeling, we were all feeling this, like a lot of anxiety, a lot of fear, a lot of worry, a lot of uncertainty about the future. We were seeing our world being upended. And so I was experiencing all these things. So I turned to my writing, because I tend to write more and I tend to write better during times of uncertainty. When I'm not feeling good, right? That's when I turn to my writing, because when I first started writing when I was 13, I did it as a way to deal with my traumas, as a way to try to like just unload all of these emotions, all of these things I was feeling. I turned to writing to help me heal from all of that. And so I know how to write during times of uncertainty. And that's why when I got married, my writing suffered. And I told my husband, you're gonna make me miserable. I can't write. So thanks to the pandemic, I could write now. I wrote and I wrote and I wrote and I wrote, and so it helped me. But the other way it helped me too was that my characters, they were experiencing their world being upended. They were also experiencing anxiety and fear and all of these things. So I was able to connect with them in a very emotional way, because now I knew, because I was feeling those things. So when you read the book, like those feelings really do come across as very raw and very, very authentic, because I gave them what I was feeling during these times of uncertainty.
For me, it totally sucked. It was really difficult. I really liked to write like in coffee shops. I used to travel a lot, and I would do some of my best writing on a plane, because there were no distractions. I couldn't be like, I'll write later. I'm gonna go wash the dishes.
You're literally strapped to your seat.
Exactly. So you have to write. It's like, well, you could watch a movie, which I did sometimes. But I used to write. So these spaces where I used to write and where I used to get really inspired, were totally gone. And then writing at home, same. Fernando has also ruined me. And then he started working from home too. So then we started sharing this space, and I like to write with music on, and he can't have music on when he's working. And so it was like all of these very like adjustments that we all had to make, right? All of us who started working from home know what it's like to have to readjust to your workspace being your living space. So that was really challenging. And also like some of these research that I was doing, I couldn't access it because if I wanted, libraries were closed for a while. You couldn't even check out books, and so I couldn't get access to some of the things that I needed access to. So all of that was really challenging, and there were times when I was just like depressed because of the pandemic, and so I couldn't write. So it was a really challenging time for me to write. And then, to be honest, like I was also really worried about how is it going to be selling a book, marketing a book, when you can't have this, right? When you can't connect to the reader and to the audience in this way. And I was already kind of getting tired of all the Zoom events. Like Zoom was great, but like you can't get this. And so all of these things were like worrying me. But it also gave me something to do. It sort of gave me a goal. It sort of gave me a thing that I had to get through, that I had to do, that I had to turn in. Having these deadlines were helpful because it gave me something else to focus on other than, the world around us sort of getting crushed every day. So there was good things and bad things, but for the most part, it sucked.
Well, you did a great job with it not being the best of times. We're closing up with time, and I want to make sure that we have enough time for questions from the audience. But I think the last question I would love to ask both of you is, what is the message? What would you like readers to receive and learn and take from your work?
Well, I think I touched on it earlier about how it's important to reclaim our history, especially as, the Mexican-American community. We have to reclaim it. We have to start telling these stories because for so long, we are always made out to look as if we're the outsiders, as if all of us crossed the border, right? And I know some of us did, but some of us were here already, and yet that history is denied. And that has really affected us as a community, constantly making us, turning us into the other, into the outsider, the foreigner, the ones who should not be here. And I think for me, we have to push back against that, and that's what my book tries to do, and Julissa's book tries to do that too.
So for a while, so I will say two things. One is, I don't have like a specific thing I want you to get out of the book, because my whole point for writing this book is for you to have conversations about it, and for you to take whatever it is that I've written and get meaning out of it, whatever it means to you. Because it's a manifesto. This book is a manifesto. So I am telling you what I think, right? I'm telling you my opinions. I'm telling you what I got out of this history that I read. And you're either going to agree with it or you're not going to agree with it. Maybe you're going to agree with some parts you might really strongly disagree with them, as some people have let me know on my DMs. And that's okay. But my biggest goal with this book is to create conversations, right? For us to start having these conversations that are long overdue. But if there is one thing, it's like, look around this room. Just look around. Just take 1 second to look around. Look who's here. All the beautiful people are here. But the reason I wanted you to look around this room is because I used to think that in order to be successful, that in order to matter, there would have had to be a room full of white people here. Because I sought their approval for so long. And I look at this room, and I'm very emotional, and I think, wow. The event was sold out tonight, and you're the ones who sold it out. this is all we need. We are and we have been more than enough. So if there's one thing for you to get out of this book, is to take your incredibly gorgeous, beautiful bodies and walk into every room like you deserve to be there, because you do.
We have a few minutes now left for our Plática. If anybody would like to ask a question, we can pass on the microphone. Don't be shy. You'll get extra points if you have a question. Do we want to pass on the mic, or do you want to just speak loud? Yeah, if you'd like to tell us your name and your question, please.
Hello, my name is I am 17 years old. My father over here told me that my father over here is very, very prideful towards his country. He was born in Puebla. My mother was born in Sinaloa. And what his pride for his country, I'm going to admit, sometimes annoys me. But little by little, I'm starting to realize that, as annoyed I get of having to buy street tacos sometimes, how does he get that goodness? Where does he get it from? What's the point of being prideful if you're looked down? If you're a mixture of European and indigenous, what's the point? What is the point? And admittedly, I've grown up I'm a U.S. citizen. I grew up in South Central. My childhood home, 28th Street, and so yeah. I've struggled with depression, 2 suicide attempts, suicide struggle. And, I believe that the root that caused this depression was of isolation, of having to be American in order to be standing right here on this land, And I didn't start growing pride for history, because I did not like history in 8th grade. I hated history. My teacher, he liked me. I don't know why. I don't exactly know why he liked me. I got good grades in this class, but I found this content to be extremely boring. So in my senior year, right now, I'm going to graduate next month. I had a Mexican-American lit class, and my teacher, Ms. Garcia, gave me a book. And you know what that book is? The Distance Between Us. And I read it. I could not put the book down. I missed phone calls. I did not. I wanted to know more about Reyna Grande's life, her struggles, her traumas. And after the book was done, I had to share it to my father, because he jumped the border too. He lived that when he was 11 years old with his sisters and his mother. So I got the book immediately after finishing it and gave it to my dad and said, "Dad, you gotta read this." And needless to say, he absolutely fell in love with it, really loved it in every way. So Reyna Grande, I just want to thank you for
So much. That really means a lot to me, because it makes me think of my children too, because my children deal with a lot of the same, inner turmoil and the things that you're expressing. And I want to believe that they will get to know me and understand me in the way that now you understand your dad, by reading my story. So thank you, and I really hope that you continue, to want to learn more about your dad and to get that pride, because that is a beautiful thing, to be proud of where you come from. So you have to be proud.
I think I have a question back there.
So, hi everyone, Christina Vista. Yeah, thank you for the Plática. And I had a question because I actually just started writing my own first novel. And I'm wondering, how do you rein in all of these ideas that you have? Because it's kind of like it's a fictional novel loosely based on my life. And I'm trying to really highlight my grandma's experience and my similarities with her and just the strength that I draw from her story. But there's so much that has happened, and I also relate to, having started writing when I was a child, poetry, journaling, just trying to work through my traumas. And so it's a very healing experience. But I also feel like there's so many different ideas and ways I could write. So I'm just wondering, how do you process all the ideas that come up?
Yeah, finding a theme, the themes that you're exploring really helps, especially if you're writing autobiographical stuff. Like when I wrote The Distance Between Us, I realized that I was writing about distance, that was my theme, whether it's physical distance, emotional distance, distances created by assimilation or language. So that's why when you read the book, almost everything that I put in it has to do with some kind of distance. And that helped me because when you write memoir, you have so many memories, but you cannot include them all because then it just becomes a collection of memories with no narrative arc. There's no story. It's just, then this happened, then that happened, then that happened, then that happened, and then the reader starts to wonder, well, so what? Right? And then with A Dream Called Home, I wrote that book very quickly because I had learned so much from writing A Distance Between Us, and I knew I have to find my theme. And my theme in A Dream Called Home was the search for home, the search for belonging. And so, every chapter ties into me leaving my home or searching for home or even the men I write about, it has something to do with home where they took me to their home or I took them to mine so the home was the central theme that I was exploring and that search for belonging. And then with the novel, with Ballad, one of my central themes was divided loyalties. And you see it playing out in John Riley, in Jimena, in Santa Ana. They're all dealing with divided loyalties. Yeah. So find your theme.
And I would just add that you're saying you have all these different ideas, right? You don't have to put all of them in one book. Right? There could be different books. You end up writing 3 or 4 books and each one based on these ideas that you have, because you can include everything. And one of the hardest things to do is when you write something and then an entire chapter has to be cut out. And that used to be really painful for me because I was like, I spent so much time writing that. But now I just find it part of the process. I almost look at it as like when you're building a building and there's scaffolding around the building. And it's kind of ugly and messy, right? And then eventually you start taking the scaffolding down and you start building and this beautiful thing emerges. So don't be afraid to write things that you're gonna delete later on. Because, don't delete them, copy and paste them. So you have it, save it. But then you can, then that can be a book later down the line also.
Or an op-ed, or an essay,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. My name is Alex. I took your suggestion and looked around, and just as an aside, Kathy, son todos mujeres. I know that can be a whole other topic, but I wonder there's something there about who we are and what helps us think. And if your goal was to stimulate, your goal is to stimulate discussion, because my wife is starting a book club. And also thanks to Reyna's work. But it's obvious that you were very touched by Andres Fajardo's killing. And you have some statistics there that I've never seen before.
Yeah.
About the number of Latinos out of the LAPD.
Yes.
And there is no magic bullet. But what runs through your mind as to what we can do? Anything that comes to your mind as to what do we do about that situation or all of this? I know there's no magic bullet.
Yeah.
But I just wondered if you had any thoughts about that.
Yeah, thank you. Could everybody hear? Yeah? Great. Otherwise, I was going to repeat how he said that there was majority women here. And I was like, yeah. But to your question, so there are statistics that I share in the book. And part of the problem is that most police departments are not required to report on ethnicity when there is an officer-involved shooting. They only have to report race. So many Latinos are classified as either white or black. And of course we know there's black Latinos, right? But if they're black Latino, then I think that there should be a sort of Latino category as well so that we can keep better track of these things, because I think the first step in the problem is to recognize, to know how big this problem really is, right? In LA, 50% of officer-involved shootings involve a Latino. 50% of the people that the LAPD kills are Latino. 50%. And nationally, something like 2,600 Latinos have been killed, in a 2 or 3 year period. So there are organizations that are trying to do this work of really uncovering the statistics and for us to really truly understand how big the problem is. I have a lot of ideas and in talking to people that do this work daily of things that need to happen. And I know in certain, even progressive circles saying defund the police becomes this sort of like, what do you mean defund the police? But we have to understand what that really means. Right? Defunding the police means we're taking those resources and putting them in things that are actually going to make communities safe. Because let me tell you something, if there is a cop going through my neighborhood, harassing the people in my neighborhood, that's not making us safer. And if somebody needs to commit a crime because they need to put food on the table, that cop being there isn't going to stop them. Cops don't stop people from committing crimes. And that's not just me saying it, like that's studies and statistics and deep work that people have done. Now, is there a place for police? Sure. And I know a lot of people like to say, well, what about rapists and what about killings? Do you know how many rapes are actually solved? So sure, let's put all the cops to figuring out and putting behind jails rapists. So yes, there is a place for police probably, but we've got to understand where these things come from. Like there's many countries in this world where police don't carry guns. Why does a cop need an AK-47? So there is a way to reimagine public safety that would dramatically decrease the number of officer-involved shootings. That would keep our community safe, and that would keep them safe too, probably. So that's, you asked a very big question that I'm really passionate about. And I could keep going, but we gotta go sign some books. But those are some thoughts I could share with you.
Thank you.
I think we had one more here. Or can you just share?
I was going to say that I saw your book and on Facebook, and it only had like 5 chapters, the distance between us, and I couldn't put it down, so I went to the library and I got it out because my father's from Guerrero, and that's what got me to you. And now Ballad is my grandparents are from Texas when it was a republic, so your both books have really touched me.
Yeah, I think maybe one more back here.
Hi, my name is Philip. I'm a writer. I actually started writing comic books back in like 2003. And I eventually actually took some writing workshops with Reyna. And in 2016, I wrote a novelette and published it, self-published it. And I got an International Latino Book Award for it. So I want to thank Reyna for her support as a writer. And my question actually for Reyna is, I know that your husband Corey is white and you're Mexican, and I was just wondering, like, how did that influence your new book? Because you said it's a story about an Irish guy in love with a Mexican woman. I was wondering, did your relationship?
Put me on the spot here. Yeah, well, okay, so when I was working on John Riley, there were two men that I thought about when I was writing him. The first one was my father, because my father was husband and father who left his wife and children behind in poverty in Guerrero, came here to look for a better life for his family. And John Riley was the same. You know, he left Ireland, which, as you know, in the 1840s, Ireland was a very, very poor country. It was going through a famine. So many people died. And he joined the U.S. Army because he wanted to save money to send for his wife and his son, and try to have enough money to get land, a bit of land, so that they could build a home, you know, and start anew in this country. So I thought a lot about my dad. And the other connection I made was that my father, when he got to Los Angeles, and you read The Distance Between Us, so you know that, he met another woman, a nurse assistant, and he fell in love with her, and he ended up leaving my mother for this woman. And it really broke my mother's heart. So in my novel, John Riley, when he meets Jimena, who's a curandera, who's a combat nurse in the army, he struggles with that, you know, because he has a wife back in Ireland, and here's Jimena, and he can't help falling in love with her. And so I was trying to explore my father's story and try to understand him, because I know it happens. I mean, we have all heard stories, right, of the men who have come here and met new women, started new lives. I mean, it's a common immigrant story. So I was trying to explore that about my father. And then the other man that I thought about was my husband, because John Riley, he resists that temptation. He has, you know, he was a lot stronger than my father was. He actually honored his marriage vows, and I thought about my husband, because my husband is one of the most honorable men I have ever met. You know, I trust him completely. He has really shown me a lot of love and devotion and support, and he just has so many beautiful qualities that, you know, I brought into John Riley's character. So I did use my husband, not that he's white, but that he's a good man, regardless of his skin color.
Awesome. Did we have just one more, I think, up here? I saw a hand up.
This is for Reyna. I read your book and I loved it. And as I was reading it, I was thinking of how many personal things you shared in the book. And I was telling my friend that when I was growing up in our family, it was like, you don't talk about what happens in this family. It stays in the house, in the family. So I was wondering, did you have any pushback from your family? What was their reaction to the things that you shared about them?
I didn't have pushback from the people that I cared about. You know, like my siblings, for example. They're not suing me yet. You know, so it's good. We're still talking to each other. And I wanted to honor our truth, as even if it's uncomfortable, or especially because it's uncomfortable. You have to write about it, and you have to stand in your truth, and you cannot change things just because it's going to hurt people or make people uncomfortable. You know, the way things happen, that is how things happen. And I wasn't writing the memoir out of revenge. You know, it didn't come from a place where I said, oh, I'm gonna write a book and get back at everybody that ever hurt me. You know, that was not my intent. So in a way, it was actually the opposite, where I said, let me write this story so that I could try to understand, so that I can then forgive, right? So it came from the right place. And I think my siblings and my other relatives saw that, and they respected that. Yeah. So it's good. We're all good. How about you? I mean, you've written memoir, so you get to deal with this too.
Yeah, so before this book I wrote, and I'm actually also from Guerrero, so Reyna and I.
She was born in the nice part of Guerrero. Tasco.
Yeah, Tasco is beautiful, and I described Iguala as being this like dusty town, and then Reyna was like, yep, it was a dusty town. And I shared.
We do have good pichones, okay? And you do write about the pichones.
I love the pichones; they're so good. So in my first book, My Underground American Dream, I shared the story of being undocumented. I was undocumented for 14 years and worked on Wall Street. I used fake papers when I worked on Wall Street. But the most difficult thing to write about was my relationship with my dad. And my siblings did one of my siblings in particular raised some concerns because she felt like, especially because our dad had passed away, that like I wasn't honoring him by sharing these difficult things about him. But I said to her that we just had different experiences with our dad. Like she never came to live in the US, and so there's things that she never saw. And I share also how much I loved my dad and how many things he taught me and how much of him I still carry. So I thought that the best way to honor him was to be truthful about the difficult relationship that we had. Because things are complicated. And I think once I decided I was going to write a memoir, that's also deciding that you're going to tell the truth. And some of that truth might be really painful to tell. And in some ways it is more difficult and more embarrassing when somebody I know has read that book and has read all the things I shared in that book than like strangers. I mean, most of you I won't see again. I hope I do come to the next event. But
We have another book coming out next month. We gotta see you again.
Oh yeah, we do. Somewhere We're Human, that Reyna edited and I wrote an essay for it. So yeah, writing memoir is hard, but if you're gonna do it, it's like otherwise your reader can tell when you're skirting around things. You know, you can always tell in a book when someone's like, they're being very polite about this, and that's not fun. So you gotta be truthful.
Well, you ladies are going to be sending books outside, right? I also encourage all of you. We talked about also supporting bookstores, local bookstores, making sure that we support the women in our lives that are doing these projects. I think that's also something extremely important in learning about like the publishing space. So make sure you grab a book if you haven't so far, and make sure that you meet the ladies and get an autograph.
And
thank you
to Yarel for
Thank you. Thank you guys for coming. Thank you so much. This was great.